Hello and welcome to another video of the REFramework series. In the last 3 videos, we were understanding the concepts on which the REFramework is based. And in this video, with the help of the concepts learned, we're going to sketch the state diagram for the REFramework. Also, I would like to add that back in 2017, when the first time I was using UiPath, I was only using flowcharts and sequences to build my automations. But during one of the sessions with colleagues from UiPath, they suggested us to use REFramework. And during this time, since there were not so many resources available related to REFramework, it took us almost 3 to 4 weeks to really understand the REFramework and get a grasp of it. But as of now, there are multiple videos available and a lot of them are really good ones. So this video is my take on REFramework. So without wasting any time, let's have a look at the agenda. So like I said, when I started using the REFramework, I was a bit scared initially. And this was mainly because it was the first time that I was using state machine diagrams. And I really did not understand how different states were connected to each other and how the transitions worked. So that is the reason why I would not go into UiPath just right now, but instead try to sketch the state diagram with you and try to understand how each of these states are connected to each other with the transitions. And we'll also see what are the different kind of exceptions that are there in REFramework and how they are being handled. But before we start sketching that, let's just take an example around which we will be making our REFramework. So like in most of my examples, I will be taking the invoice processing as an example for REFramework. And this invoice processing would be coming from this RPA challenge. I've already made a video on how to solve this RPA challenge, but this one was without REFramework. So let's just have a look at this challenge. So we see here, basically there is a web interface wherein you have multiple invoices, and these invoices are spread over 3 different pages. So as a challenge, what we need to do is we need to download each of these invoices and extract few data out of it. When I say we need to extract data, it's mainly the invoice number, the invoice date, the company name, and the total due amount. And we don't need to extract the data for all of these invoices. We will be only extracting data from those invoices for which the due date has been passed or it is today. So once we have extracted all the data, this data has to be saved into a CSV file, and then this CSV file has to be uploaded. So let's just go ahead and start sketching the state diagram. So this is a worksheet. Let's try sketching the state diagram for an REFramework. Every state machine starts with a starting state, which is represented by a circle. And after the starting state, you have the init state. So let's draw our init block here and name it as init. So in order to understand this init state, just take an example of a trip that you're planning. And before you start your trip, you always try to make some checks. For example, you'll make sure that the hotel is booked. You make sure that you have your passport, you have your tickets, your flights are on schedule, and only then you start your journey. Similarly, when you're starting an automation, you also tend to make some checks. You try to check if the application that has to be used by your automation is available or not. And depending on that, you proceed further. So let's list down the steps that needs to be followed. The very first step is you need to initialize some settings. So initialize settings. And when I say settings, these are some sort of variables that will be used within your automation and can be read from a config file. So these settings normally come from a local config file, which is an Excel file, or there are some settings that can also come from the orchestrator. So this config file is part of the REFramework, and we'll have a look into this config file when we open UiPath Studio. So once you have initialized all the settings, the next step is you initialize all the applications. So the same thing again, when I say we initialize application, so for example, let's say you are doing an automation with SAP or with some website. In that case, you will just make sure that SAP is available. So you just log into SAP with some credentials and you just see if you're able to log into SAP or not. And in case of a website, you just try to load that particular URL and see if particular element is available on the screen or not. And if this element is available, then it means that this application is available as well. So you do make these checks to just ensure that the application that you want to use is available, and only then you proceed with the automation. So like I said, the starting state is connected with the init state. So let's make that joint here. And if there is any failure, then instead of proceeding further with the automation, you just go to the end process state. So now this is the second state here, or the second block, known as the end process state. So let's draw that one as well. And now let's connect the init state with the end process state. And you go from init to end process whenever there is a system exception. So when I say system exception, it means the application that you want to use was not available or you were not able to log into those systems. So let's name it. So the line connecting the init and the end process is nothing but the transition. And let me just color this. So system exception is one of the transitions. Similarly, there are multiple other transitions that will be available within the REFramework. In total, there are 7 transitions, and this is just one of them. And all the blocks that you see here are nothing but the states. So let's name it. These are states. Init is one state and process is another state. And if you want to really understand in depth what states are, what transition are, this is something that I've explained in my third video. And here's the link on the top. So just click on that and go and check out what state machines are. So now coming back to our sketch here. So like I said, if there's an exception, you go to the end process, and if everything is successful, it means you've been able to initialize all the settings, you have been able to initialize all the applications, then in that case, you go to your next state, which is the get transaction data state. So let's make that block here as well. And this is the get transaction data state. And the connection between init and this state is when you're successful in initializing all your applications. So this is another state. Now, in order to understand what happens inside the get transaction data state, you need to recall my second video of the REFramework series, where we were talking about different kind of processes that can happen inside a business. And one of the processes was the transactional process. So the REFramework uses transactional process in order to make it automations scalable. And if you want to understand this in depth, then just click on the link above. But in order to understand the get transaction data state within REFramework, I'll again come back to my example of invoice processing. So we saw on the RPA challenge page that there were around 12 invoices that have to be downloaded. So within the get transaction data, this is where we get all these invoices. And at the same time, we will be splitting these transaction data into a smallest possible entity. So before we go there, let's just write a first step. So we get all transaction data in this state. And after getting all the transaction data, what you do is you split this transaction data into transaction items. So let's just first write that before I explain what I mean. So split them into transaction items. So in order to understand that, let's again come back to our example. Let's say we have downloaded all the invoices, and every invoice that needs to be processed would then be considered as one transaction item. So if we were to define what a transaction item is, so let's say a transaction item is the smallest possible entity that your automation can process. So in our example, what we need to do is we are processing different invoices. So every invoice for us is a transaction item. So having said that, so once you're in the get transaction state, this can go in two directions. So you have your 10 or 12 invoices, and with every transaction item or with every invoice that you need to process, you will go to the process state. So let's draw our process state here. This is also the core of our automation. And I say this is the core of our automation is because everything apart from the process state is something that is just part of the framework. This is just making our framework more robust. But the process is the only part in which we are actually interested. So we're just interested in extracting data. So like I said, within the get transaction data, it can go in two directions. So the very first direction is that you go towards your process state. So you go to process state whenever there is a new transaction item. So what I mean by new transaction item is that when you're processing your invoices, in our case it's 12 invoices, every new invoice is considered as a new transaction item. So till the time you have invoices left to process, you would be always following the path from get transaction data to the process state. And the moment you have processed all the invoices, it means you have processed all your 12 invoices. This is the time when you do not have any data left, or this is time of the second transition, which is moving from get transaction data to the end process. So you move to the end process only and only when you do not have any data left. So this is your no data transition. So let's color our transitions again. And now moving forward, like I said, the process is the core of your automation. And in this state, a lot of things can go wrong. In our case, wherein we are processing invoices, it can happen that the invoice that you're processing has some fields which are missing, or the website from which you were downloading your invoices is no more available because the server is down, or your website just hanged, or there is no internet connection, or anything that can go wrong. So in order to handle all these exceptions, the RE framework has divided exception into two types. One is known as the business rule exception, and the other one is known as the system exception. And each of these exceptions are handled in a different way. So first, in order to understand a business rule exception, I'll go back to our example of invoice processing. So let's say you're processing an invoice, and inside the RPA challenge, we said that we will only process an invoice if the due date for that particular invoice has passed or it is today. And in all the other cases wherein the due date is in the future, we will not be processing that invoice. So this could be defined as one of the business rule exception. So when you pass that invoice as a transaction item to the process should just skip that particular transaction item and go back to the get transaction data and get the new transaction item. So that would mean we need to connect a process state with the get transaction data state. And this is the case when there is a business rule exception. So the bot will do is it will just skip that particular invoice and go back to the get transaction data to get the next invoice. Similarly, we said there could be other exceptions. So these other exceptions are something which have not yet been defined by the business, or this is something that is related to the system that you're using or the application that you're using. So such exceptions are like your website is not available anymore, or the server is down, or somehow you're not able to log into SAP anymore. And in all such cases, what you just do is, instead of skipping that transaction, you go back to your init state. So let's first connect our process with the init state. So the reason that in case of any system exception, we go to the init state is because, like I said before, inside the init state, we are initializing all our applications. So in case a system or an application is not available anymore, you could just go inside the init state and reinitialize those applications. And once the applications are reinitialized, then you can again proceed with your automation. So let's name it again. So this transition was nothing but your system exception. And let me color this transition again. So what that means is, let's say your system was down. So you went back to your init state. You reinitialize your application and then go back to get transaction data. Take the same transaction item that was running before and then go back to the process state in order to restart the same process that was not done for that particular transaction item. So I would just remove these lines to stop any confusion. So till now we were just talking about the exceptions that can happen inside the process state. But in most of the cases, your process goes fine and everything is successful. It means you're being able to extract the data that needs to be extracted from the invoice. So then there is another transition that happens, which is nothing but the success transition. So the invoice that you were processing has been successfully extracted. So you go back to your get transaction data and get the next transaction item. And this transition is again the success transition. And once all the invoices have been processed, then the last step is your no data transition, which is you go to the end process. And within the end process, you do nothing but you close all your applications. So you close all the applications which were running. So it means you will be closing the website that we were running. And if you're not able to close it, then you just kill that particular process. Within the end process, you could also add your own steps. For example, so after you have extracted all the data and you have uploaded the CSV file, then you want to send your users or the stakeholders a notification saying that the process was successful. So this is also something that you can do in your end process. So send notifications to stakeholders. So notification could also be a failure notification. For example, there was a system failure and your bot was not able to process all the invoices. In that case as well, you need to send some message to the stakeholder saying that this automation did not run as it was supposed to. So if we just have a look at the complete state machine diagram, there are basically 5 states. So the first state is your starting state. Then you have your init state. You have your get transaction state. Then you have your process state. And then the last one is the end process state. And each of these states are connected to each other with different transitions. So we have in total 7 transitions and 5 states within the REFramework. So just to summarize, you start with the starting block, go to the init phase where you initialize all the application, and then you go to the get transaction data where you try to split all your data into transaction items, and thereafter you try to process each of the transaction item. Once all the item has been processed, then you go to the end process and then close all your application. Well, that's all as far as the state machine diagram of REFramework is concerned. I hope I was able to clarify how the state machines work within the REFramework. And if you have any more questions related to REFramework, then feel free to post in the comments below. And in our next video, we will be going into UiPath Studio and open an REFramework and see each of these states in detail. So see you again in my next video. Until then, stay safe and keep automating.